thank you so much. This is a very exciting time to talk about trade. And also, thank you also to put this type of title, Europe Quo Vadis. I see that the Romans are still running the title.
Not the Italians.
Not the Italians, the Romans. Anyway, thank you. Welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this kind of discussion on free trade in the 21st century. A timely, thought-provoking collection of articles run by Max Rangeley and Lord Daniel Hanna. This book brings together leading economists, policymakers, thinkers to revisit the moral, political, economic case for free trade in a moment that global openness is in decline for the first time in the last 10 years. So I think it's time to rebuild the narrative on free trade, because it's something that's been affected from both sides, from the left and from the right side, part of the right side. So Max and Daniel remind us in this book, the bottom line is that globalization and open market have been among the most powerful tools to as a poverty reduction in history. So despite that, again, from some part of the leftist political spectrum, right political spectrum, there is a criticism of it. So it's time also as a free market conservative, we need to rebuild this narrative. So, and this is a reason that we are here to present this fantastic, really awful policy maker they need to read, maybe in a short version, not stupid, but definitely this is a very important step. Saying that, I want to introduce the next speaker is Max. He's leading the Copland Center. He's an economic think tank research center based in London. He's also serving several board think tank in London and Brussels. His work emphasized the intersection of economics and emerging technology. So he's a lot. I know he's also an expert in artificial intelligence, not only artificial. So, Max, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and good afternoon, everybody. And yes, so this book, which we put together, is really, we did this as something like a definitive work for free trade in the modern age. And this has chapters, of course, by many top professors, including a Nobel Prize winner. But then, as well as that, there are also a number of politicians and other policymakers, for instance, as well, including former prime ministers of both the UK and Australia. And Barbara kindly wrote an excellent chapter as well. And Lord Lilly, for instance, who was the trade minister under Margaret Thatcher. So these chapters really go into some of the complexities with negotiating trade agreements, even when the people in charge of the whole process are very pro-free trade. There are a lot of different interests pushing and pulling in different directions, which make it difficult. But this book really goes through everything all in one volume. And since this is published by Springer Nature, for those of you at universities, you can of course access it through your Springer Nature subscription to be used for teaching. But if you want to understand today how wealthy we are as a result of free trade, you don't really need to read through spreadsheets or economic statistics. You actually just need to take a stroll down to your local supermarket and look around you, because it is absolutely extraordinary the quality of all of the goods that you have on offer. There's a scene in the novel The Count of Monte Cristo where the main character Edmond Dantes has become the Count of Monte Cristo. He's fabulously wealthy, and he has these banquets, and he has these exotic fruits available, like pineapples and so on. And again, in the 19th century, most people had never seen a pineapple. Most people have probably never even heard of a pineapple. Yet today, a regular person, like an electrician, with just 1 or 2 hours' wages, can walk into a supermarket and just buy all of these exotic fruits, pineapples, mangoes, kiwis, whatever you can think of. And so this is really an extraordinary period of history, largely thanks to free trade. But today I'm going to be talking about the history of free trade and how it led up to this moment. And of course, free trade has also been connected with geopolitical power throughout history as well. And so if you were to return to the supermarket, for instance, and go to the spice aisle, actually for hundreds of years, many wars were fought over spice routes. Thousands of people died in these battles, states fighting for access to spices. And that you can just walk down to the local supermarket and have more spices than you could ever use in a lifetime. And if you could just take those just from one spice aisle in the supermarket and go back a few hundred years, you would be a multi-millionaire. So discussing the history of free trade then today, I think it's important not just to discuss the history of free trade in the 20th century or even from Adam Smith onwards. What I'm actually going to do is go back a few thousand years before even the Romans and the Greeks, and I'm going to start in the Bronze Age with the Phoenicians. So a little over 3,000 years ago, the Phoenicians were a Bronze Age civilization based roughly where Lebanon is today. And the Phoenicians had significant natural resource constraints. They were not able to be self-sufficient in terms of food, so they had to trade. They were somewhat like Singapore in that sense, which even has to import water. The Phoenicians became maritime pioneers. In the Bronze Age, they built ships capable of hauling 30, 40 or even 50-ton cargoes, which was quite extraordinary. And they built commercial networks around the Mediterranean, including trading colonies on Cyprus and Malta, in Spain, and perhaps most famously in North Africa. Carthage started out as a Phoenician trading colony. And their trading networks reached as far as Britain, from where they got their tin. They referred to Britain as the Tin Islands. And they exported luxury goods, by and large. For instance, purple dye, or Tyrian purple, which was a prized luxury good in the classical world. But all this trade also amplified the diffusion of technologies around the Mediterranean, in particular alphabet. The Phoenicians effectively invented the first modern alphabet, as we would think about it. And it was a far more efficient form of writing than either cuneiform or hieroglyphs, which was used by the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians at the time. And as the alphabet spread around the Mediterranean, the Greeks adapted it in the early 8th century BC. And then it also went on to become the Latin alphabet and also actually the Cyrillic alphabet as well. So all of these quote-unquote Western alphabets have the Phoenician alphabet as their origin. And the spreading of this radical idea largely came about as a result of trade. And the Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos became centers of culture, religion, and politics. The Phoenicians became cultural brokers, carrying Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek ideas and technologies all around the Mediterranean. And in fact, there is a work of literature from ancient Egypt around 1000 BC called The Story of Wenamun, about an Egyptian priest that travels in search of some high-quality wood for making religious artifacts. And he travels to Phoenicia and comments on how the harbour at Sidon always has 50 vessels at anchor, which was quite extraordinary at the time, and how prosperous they were. And so what I'm going to do for each of these, let's call them case studies through economic history, I'll give a lesson or two that we can learn from each of them. And so the Phoenicians then, I think perhaps the most important lesson that we can learn is that trade is not just about the exchange of goods. It's also about the exchange of ideas. And this often happens even more organically than the exchange of goods. So we saw how the alphabet spread. But in actual fact, in further periods of free trade, ideas would continue to spread for the next few thousand years. And so then we move on to another great trading civilization, the Athenians, well, especially the Golden Age of Athens. And Athens is also in a strategic location in the Mediterranean, and they have significant resource constraints. They cannot be self-sufficient with respect to agriculture. In fact, if we think about their population in the Golden Age of Athens, roughly around the time of Pericles, according to the historian Mogens Hansen, was around 300,000 people. And the Athenians needed to import 400 shiploads of grain every year to be able to support this large and growing population. And so they became another great trading civilization. And in fact, the Athenian port, known as the Piraeus, was a triple harbour complex. And at its peak, the ship sheds covered 110,000 metres squared and could house 372 ships. And a lot of these were naval ships, but many of them were, of course, for trade. And this was among the largest roofed complexes in antiquity. So when Themistocles built the famous Athenian navy, which was used to beat the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, the Athenians built 200 ships, but they cost 58 pounds of silver each. It was very expensive to build these navies. And so the fact that the Athenians were also a trading civilization meant that that essentially this navy would pay for itself over time. And in fact, a few decades later, the thinker Xenophon, who was a historian and philosopher, and also actually a part-time mercenary, funny enough, he wrote on how Athens, rather than pursuing an empire, should become essentially a pure trading centre. It should invite merchants from all around the Mediterranean, and that will be the future. But also in Athens, what this led to was an extraordinary development in the rule of law, and in particular contract law. So when merchants do business, on the whole they want to do business somewhere where there is a stable rule of law, where the government isn't just going to overrule contracts and seize their assets. And that is indeed what we saw in Athens. And the famous orator Demosthenes, some of the cases that he argued in court were around freedom of contract and property rights and so on. So we can see in a legal situation how strong the rule of law was. And of course this also contributed to the cultural flourishing of Athens at the time, which, like Phoenicia, became a hub of ideas and exchange. And the historian Herodotus also explains how these trade networks became an essential part of interactions between different cultures at the time. But Athens also built resilience through these trade networks during times of war. And the military historian Thucydides, and later the Roman historian Polybius, discussed how controlling trade routes and commerce was really becoming central to political and military power. Just as it is today, this is not a new phenomenon. It didn't begin during World War I or the Napoleonic Wars. This idea of controlling trade routes being central to power has been present for thousands of years. And so I think the key thing we can learn from the Athenians is that free trade is also linked with the rule of law and freedom of contract. And that has been the case ever since. And so we move on then to the Romans. And the Romans referred to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, or our sea. Yet this was not just about military domination. The Romans built an extraordinary infrastructure for trade around the Mediterranean. There was, of course, the Pax Romana from Augustus onwards. But before that, the Lex Garbinia laws in 67 BCE gave Pompey the Great extraordinary powers to stamp out piracy around the Mediterranean, which was a major problem. And anyone who visited Rome would comment on the extraordinary diversity of goods in the markets. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, silk from China, and spices from India. But to feed the huge Roman population of around 1 million at its peak, Rome also needed to import 250 tons of grain a year. And this concerned some Roman thinkers, but also the amount that they were purchasing from the east, from China and India. Roughly 100 million sesterces per year were flowing east. And there's one famous papyrus, the Museris papyrus, found in Egypt, which was essentially like invoices from the time, which shows a single shipment of 10 million sesterces. So that's around $50 million of silk and spices from the east to Rome. And so it was at this time that Pliny the Elder raised his concerns about all this coinage flowing east for these goods. So he was in favour of an early form of mercantilism, actually. Yet other thinkers like Cicero, the Roman philosopher and statesman, was a proponent of natural law, and in particular the protection of private property. He viewed property as essential to human flourishing, and by extension also trade. And at its peak, the Roman Empire was 5 million square kilometres. There was around 80,000 kilometres of paved roads, 400,000 kilometres of total roads. And figures like Livy and Tacitus described how the economic prosperity of Rome was linked to its control over this vast empire. But even at the peak of Roman power, there were actually only 30 legions, or around 150,000 soldiers, Roman soldiers, and perhaps another 100 or 150,000 pulled from various provinces around the empire. So this was nowhere near enough to control an empire this size through pure military domination. It was really through commerce. For the first time in history, you had essentially an almost like a free trade area around the Roman Empire. Someone in Britain, which was a very primitive country at the time, could suddenly buy goods from Egypt or Syria or perhaps even India or China, and vice versa. So quite an extraordinary achievement. And this, of course, also led to developments in terms of the legal system, freedom of contract, maritime loans, and so on. But stable coinage had served as a key feature of the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic, which facilitated a lot of this trade. And the denarius, for instance, had been 98% silver for many years. Yet by 250 CE, it was reduced to 50%, and then a few decades later would be only 5% silver. And this, the Romans debasing their own coinage, really contributed to the decline in trade around the Roman Empire. Because if you're a merchant doing business with people thousands of miles away, you need stable money. And that is also something which we'll see recurring throughout history, is that when states debase their money, it results in a contraction of trade. And so I think the key lesson for the Romans is that a powerful hegemon can actually be very beneficial for free trade. And we see that with the USA over the last few decades as well, for instance. And so then, if we move to the other side of the world, to China. And China is a very different scenario. It's very large geographically, has a huge diversity of resources, so it can and indeed has pursued self-sufficiency at various points throughout its history. But as we'll see, it was the periods of trade in Chinese history where they had the most flourishing. And probably the most famous trade institution of Chinese history was, of course, the Silk Road, which began in the Han Dynasty from around 200 BC. And through the Silk Road, lacquerware and ceramics flowed westwards, and horses, glassware, and precious metals flowed east into China. Yet it was really from the late Tang and early Sung dynasties. The Sung dynasty was from around 970, the year 970 if I remember correctly, that really maritime trade really took off. And it was during this period, especially during the Sung dynasty, that many of the most famous Chinese inventions took place. Paper, movable type printing, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass. And Quanzhou, a trading port, which was known as the Emporium of the World in the Sung dynasty, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And in fact, two of the cities at the time, Kaifeng and Hangzhou, were around 1 million inhabitants each, so the size of Rome at its peak. And bear in mind, European cities at this time were far, far smaller than that. And it was the Sung dynasty that actively promoted seaborne commerce and used it as a source of income. And this, like the Romans and elsewhere, resulted in a cosmopolitan culture. And so the historian William Guanlin Liu has calculated that during the Sung dynasty, non-agricultural revenues from tea, commercial taxes, and customs increasingly came close to what they received in agricultural taxes. So that marks really a structural pivot towards a market, a modern market or urban economy. And at this point, more than a quarter of global GDP was China, was accounted for by China. Some people say more than a third of global GDP. And it was shortly after this in the Yuan dynasty that Marco Polo visited as well. Yet from the Ming dynasty onwards, especially the early Ming dynasty, it was Emperor Yongle who pioneered the extraordinary expeditions around India, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa, where they built those huge ships. Some people say up to 140 meters long. But those were not mostly not for trade. They actually were more a form of state pageantry. And it was shortly after that the Haijin policy was implemented, where trade with overseas merchants was actually prohibited for people in China. The late Ming dynasty, they went onto the silver standard, which required trade to bring in silver. But even then, this was certainly not free trade, as they had seen during the Sung dynasty. And following that, the Canton system developed, where all trade had to go through just one city, the city of Canton. And so, really the lesson that we can learn from this, from the various Chinese dynasties, is that even with countries that do have enough resources to pursue self-sufficiency, it still tends to be, the golden ages still tend to be the periods of free trade and open trade with the rest of the world. And so if we return to the West then, another state that we can learn a lot from is the Netherlands at the time. And in fact, by the 1670s, so roughly the time of the Canton policy being implemented in China, the Dutch merchant marine was roughly half of Europe's total merchant tonnage. And around this time as well, there was the founding of the Dutch East India Company in 1602, which was effectively the world's first multinational corporation. And this also facilitated a great flourishing in trade. It started with transferable shares, but then in 1612 capital was made permanent and general limited liability was instituted from 1623. So this really was the birth of the modern corporation in the Netherlands. And this meant that you could invest in a company which may go on for decades or even hundreds of years, and that capital could be passed on. And Dutch East India vessels made nearly 5,000 voyages to Asia. Of course, Amsterdam became incredibly wealthy. The Amsterdam Exchange was also the first modern stock market. And that's why the historian Jan de Vries has really said that this was the first modern economy. But all of these financial developments were coming about largely as a result of free trade. But beyond the Amsterdam Exchange, there was also banks, notaries, insurers, brokers, and also even an active secondary market for short selling and options, futures contracts and so on, in 17th century Amsterdam. So this was really, De Vries is correct, this is really the birth of the modern world that was happening in Amsterdam. And this, of course, also brought about a cultural flourishing as well, with Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Spinoza, among others. Yet the British and later the Americans would learn from all of this, and Britain in particular would seek to replicate these developments. But the key lesson I think we can learn from the Dutch is that during these periods of flourishing of trade, it's important to allow free enterprise, to allow these types of financial institutions to adapt to the changing circumstances. The corporation is not something that just happens intuitively. It really was quite an extraordinary innovation in the history of economics. And so we'll move on to Britain then, the next trading power. And Britain had been mercantilist for many years. That means they viewed the purpose of trade, as selling more to others than they sell to us. This is a view that recurs throughout history. They thought the purpose of trade was to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible by just selling more than you buy. Yet, as things developed, from the 18th century, and then especially the 19th century onwards, a more enlightened view developed with thinkers like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill, and they really articulated the intellectual case for free trade with comparative advantage, consumer welfare, and also international peace. Most importantly, the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 allowed free trade in grain and food. The Corn Laws had effectively functioned like a 28% tariff on imported grain. So it protected the wealthy landowners, but it made 95% of the population poorer. But with the abolition of the Corn Laws, all of a sudden regular people were far wealthier, and they could afford to buy all of these goods that were being made available by the Industrial Revolution. Shortly after that, the Cobden Chevalier Treaty in 1860 between Britain and France got rid of many tariffs, and over the next few years, trade between Britain and France doubled. And this then served as a model for other most favoured nation treaties around Europe, and this then became known as the Golden Age of Free Trade in the late 19th and early 20th century. And like Athens and other states before, the Royal Navy served to enforce a lot of this. And in fact, in around 1880, more than half of all the world's shipping flew the red ensign. And in the 1890s, British shipyards built roughly 4/5 of the world's new vessels. And it's something that we see from the Phoenicians, the Athenians, and to a certain extent the Romans, this connection between naval power and trade. But in Britain as well, as I said, they learned from the Dutch and all of these innovations in finance, and so the city would then seek to replicate those. And as trade expanded from Britain, in 1913, around half of global capital issuances were raised in London. So this also facilitated this network of trade. Yet from when Britain began to go into decline in the early 20th century, this was also when the Tariff Reform League was formed, led by Joseph Chamberlain, a member of Parliament. And although they were not really successful at the time, they did lay the foundations for the decline in free trade in Britain. Of course, World War I was also a major factor then in bringing about essentially a complete collapse in global free trade. The lesson, I think, from Britain is that which is drawn from Richard Cobden and the campaigners to end the Corn Laws, and that's that free trade is not just about exchanging goods or even ideas, it's also about world peace. The periods of free trade tend to be periods of more general cooperation between individuals, nations, and cultures. And so then we move on to the final country, which I'll talk about, which is the USA. And in the 19th century, the USA had been quite protectionist, and that's sometimes used as justification for modern protectionism. There's been some good research recently on this, for instance from Klein and Meissner, who looked at each industry in the US and the different tariffs, and found that those industries that were most protected by tariffs actually had the lowest productivity, and they were just less efficient overall. Also, Douglas Irwin, one of the best trade economists, has looked carefully at 19th century protectionism in the US and has really made the case very eloquently that the US would have grown more quickly and industrialized more quickly if there had been free trade. But it was really from the early 20th century that we saw the great American industrialists like Henry Ford making the case for free trade. Henry Ford wanted to sell his cars abroad, and he also actually had an ideological commitment to free trade as well, in promoting peace and unity among nations. And Ford wrote several letters to the New York Times and elsewhere, making the case for free trade. Interestingly, Elon Musk, when all the tariff stuff was going on earlier this year, Elon Musk also similarly said he was in favour of completely tariff-free trade between countries. Now, as I noted, World War I resulted in a massive contraction in global free trade. But if we move forward then to the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 really initiated another extraordinary contraction in free trade. In fact, so the Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed by 2 senators in the US, and it put up large tariffs on thousands of imports. And there were letters written at the time by more than 1,000 economists warning against this in the US, but it went ahead, and global trade then contracted by around 70% over the next 3 years or so, and that was really a catalyst for the years leading up to World War II. Countries put up barriers to trade all around the world, and in some cases tried to pursue self-sufficiency. And this really brings to mind that brilliant quote from Frederick Bastiat, who said, "When goods do not cross borders, soldiers will." And the 1930s and 1940s is really a classic example of that. But then it was after World War II that the US became such a brilliant leader of global free trade, with GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the Bretton Woods system, which, although far from ideal, also served to facilitate global free trade to a large degree. There was the Marshall Plan, where $13.3 billion was invested into Europe, but that was often explicitly tied to trade integration and so on as well. And dollar finance, similar to Britain had done in the late 19th century, the dollar as the world's reserve currency allowed financing to take place for investment around the world to support this growth in trade. And this has become known as the Pax Americana, the American peace. And indeed, when you think of the last 70 years or so, during the Cold War and after that, it's really difficult to imagine this period of American hegemony without free trade. It's become so normal to us. Like I said, you can just walk into a shop and buy products from anywhere in the world. But this was really as a result of the US pushing this as a global hegemon. From the 1990s then, there was another wave of free trade as global trade grew from roughly 40% of GDP to around 60% in the 2000s. Yet simultaneously as this was happening, we of course saw the rise of China as a trading power. And as I've noted, through thousands of years, even going back to the Bronze Age, the rise and fall of civilizations is closely connected with the rise and fall of trade. And in 2001, around 80% of the economies in the world traded more with the US than with China. Yet by 2023, this had almost reversed. Almost 80% of all the countries in the world traded more with China than the US. And there's one other factor which I'll touch on briefly before finishing. We actually did one other book around the same time as this, with Spring and Nature, called The Age of Debt Bubbles, which Barbara actually also wrote a chapter for. And so I have this concern at the moment. The book is on how central banks have created a series of larger and larger bubbles through lower and lower interest rates over the last generation or so. And we currently have a global debt bubble of more than $300 trillion. And although every central bank in the developed world is just as culpable as the Federal Reserve, having the dollar as the world's reserve currency has meant that much of this bubble, this debt bubble, has been exported to pretty much all around the world now. And so that, I think, I discussed earlier with Rome and the debasement of money. I think the monetary systems have often contributed to decline in that way. But in this sense, it's actually slightly different. It's not just the value of money that's going down, it's the creation of all of these debt bubbles. And so I think the key lesson, in a sense, that we can learn from this period of American hegemony is that it brought all of this together. You had a hegemon, just like the Romans. You had the rule of law, just like the Athenians. You had the exchange of ideas, like the Phoenicians. The US, actually similar to China, can pursue self-sufficiency if it wants to. But you also have these financial networks like the Dutch, and I think the US has actually made a very strong moral case for free trade for the last 75 years as well, somewhat like the British did in the age of Richard Cobden. And so thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Max, for this excellent insight and also historical overview of the Phoenician to the US. Unfortunately, the US now is leading again, not only this administration, but the previous one, the new protectionist wave. Just to remind everyone, the United States has only 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. The European Union is at 40 agreements with 70 countries. So there is also a big gap. As I mentioned, this protectionist wave is something that leftists and also part of their center right is leading now. So it's something that, as a think tanker or academics, they need to have to reveal the narrative. This book is a fantastic one. Saying that, I want to also listen and invite Dr. Pastor Zablock from the Economic Research think tank in Budapest to have an idea free trade economic policy from the Central Eastern Europe. Dr. Zablock is also associate professor at the Ludovica University of Public Service in Budapest. His research focuses on monetary and fiscal policy in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as international trade and development cooperation. And recently, in 2024, he got a very prestigious award, Hungarian for Europe Award, for his economic research work. Pastor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity. Let me tell you that what Max said was really dear for me. He highlighted a number of words, what I want to build on, and first of all, if you don't mind, I want to focus on the famous French historian Fernand Braudel, who always said that there are different types of histories. Apart from the macro history of countries, there is the micro history of communities. And for the communities, interactions, by the way, this is the word you highlighted, interactions are important. It is important what type of interaction is available for a community and what type of interaction is available for a person, because we develop based on the interactions. And once we can trade, and there is nothing what hinders us from trading with others, then we are going to develop better skills, better services, and better products. That's for sure. And let me tell you that the Central and Eastern European countries had a bad experience with that. During the communist times, we were allowed to trade with the Soviet Union only, and we were exchanging a couple of goods. But, well, I'm not blackening those people living at that time, but the consumer sophistication was quite low when in comparison with the West. So what we were exporting were definitely not dear to those who lived in the Western world. And when the political and economic transformation came, we had to learn the ropes. We had to learn about the customer satisfaction and sophistication in the West. So I champion the idea of free trade because free trade gives more, much more access to the outside world. We can learn from those interactions in many, many different ways. Let me tell you that at the university where I teach, I have a course on development economics. And based on this course, or partly based on this course, I frequently visit African countries. In Africa, the countries, they are not trading with each other. They are trading with the outside world one-sidedly. In the European Union countries mostly trade with each other. I say 80% of the total. In Africa, 20% is the ratio what I can mention. They are not trading with each other. They cannot learn from each other. They cannot develop interactions. They are one-sidedly dependent on the former colonizers, for example, on China these days and on the European Union countries. And well, they would need more opportunities. There is a fantastic program on the table. This is called the African Continental Free Trade Area. This would be about opening the boundaries, opening the borders, and giving access to the African countries to trade more or to trade even more. What is taking place when trade is limited? Max highlighted that when there are protectionist voices, there are lower levels of productivity. We had an experience, we Central and Eastern Europeans had an experience with that. The same is true for those countries where there is much protectionism these days. So regulation is definitely bad, and limiting trade is bad also. Many people say that, yeah, not many countries benefit from trade, and even my university students raise this question. I have quite a witty answer for that, and I am going to cite Joan Robinson from the 1970s. She said that it is indeed terrible when capitalists exploit countries. But there is only one more terrible thing. This is when they don't exploit other countries. This is when they don't trade with and they don't do business with other countries. That is definitely true. So free trade is like an opportunity, and it gives interactions at micro levels, at village and community levels, also at national levels. And you can be sure that even in the most underdeveloped countries, they have access to a certain extent to the outside world. They know about the standards of the outside world, so they have much to learn. And if you don't mind, I'm going to sacrifice a couple of words on your book, or on the book we are talking about. Well, Schumpeter said that when doing research we have to focus on 3 areas, and that is economic history, economic theory, and statistics. And when browsing this book, my hunger was satiated, I have to say, because I had, or we have, a bit of economic history, or not a bit, a lot of economic history to be more exact, economic theory also, and statistics. And Max, if you don't mind, I'm going to repeat my words. For example, for my students, this book is going to be great because they can better understand why trading across the borders gives opportunities, development, and interactions for the people. And when there are protectionist measures, when there are tariffs, well, the number of interactions we may enjoy, get, benefit from, learn from, is limited. And again, I go back to the history of my own country. We are heavily engaged in the automotive industry. Let me tell you that last Friday, a new factory was opened close to the Hungarian-Romanian border, and now we are going to produce BMWs as well. Our country was among those ones who voted against tariffs on electric vehicles coming from Asia, along with the Germans. And we said that tariffs are not useful. Instead, research and development would be needed. Maintaining developing competitive advantage would be needed. Tariffs are definitely not good. And there are so many other cases why we Hungarians champion free trade. 25 years ago, we had substandard export products. But now, our trade openness ratio is over 160%. We had to learn a lot, and let's hope that we wrote our homework, and we will continue benefiting from free trade and from the outside interactions. There are so many other things in my mind. I'm just going to tell you one more thing, if you don't mind. On Tuesday, I had a development economics class, and be sure that I champion free trade ideas and limited government involvement during those classes. And what I'm going to say is related to free trade. We were talking about foreign aid, and I mentioned Peter Bauer, who always said that foreign aid is like a tax on poor people living in rich countries, and the money is given to those rich people who live in underdeveloped or poor countries. So I will continue, or we Hungarians will continue championing free trade and process what comes from free trade. Thank you so much. And thank you for the book.
Thank you so much, Pastor, for your insight, your presentation. Before opening the discussion to the audience, Q&A, I have some question for you guys. So I want to start with Max. The book seeks to recapture the moral fervor, so of the original free trade advocate. So how can we relaunch this idea of a moral case, especially now we are living not only a narrative, anti-free trade narrative, but also there is a lot of political parties, left and right, that say even the globalization is wrong. So how can we use the moral case of free trade also to relaunch the idea of globalization? But I think what we need to fight is globalism and something different from globalization. So how should we focus on the moral case to rebuild free trade narrative and globalization narrative?
So I think if you look at traditional trade economics textbooks, for instance, previous to this, they're very technocratic, and you'll see lots of equations justifying trade based on flows of goods. You'll see lots of graphs being drawn and so on. And I think that entire way of thinking about things pulls us away from the Richard Cobden way of thinking, which is, trade is not just justified by analysing the statistics and looking at what goods we should be importing and so on. It's really about human brotherhood and sisterhood. And trade, as I noted, that's why I wanted to talk today about the history of trade, going back to the Bronze Age. Trade has always been associated with this flourishing of civilization. And of course it's nice to have all of these goods from everywhere, but that's really just the beginning of the benefits of trade. The next benefit is the exchange of ideas as well, as we saw going right back 3,000 years ago to the invention of the alphabet. That's been taking place. But also, again, that famous quote from Bastiat, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. That is not just about the need for goods. It's also about just humans interacting with each other. In my 20s, as you noticed, I set up a business, and I've done business with people around the world, obviously in the developed world, Europe and the US, but also India and China and elsewhere. And just that constant interaction with people in China. It's human beings doing business with other human beings, and that's what it fundamentally comes down to. And if you try and block that off, I think also at a psychological level, it makes conflict far more likely. So I think the key way to present the moral case for free trade is to talk about all of these broad benefits of free trade, not just the stuff that economists like to do, coming up with equations which look at exactly what kind of products we need to be importing and exporting.
Thank you.
Just a quick comment, if it is possible. Around 10 years ago, I worked at the Central Bank of Hungary, and at that time we had a research on the internationalization of banking. And in the European integration, we observed something interesting. Multinational corporations started investing in the other side of the borders first, and the commercial banks followed. And beautiful theoretical framework was developed called Follow Your Customer. First, those commercial banks gave financial access to the multinational corporations doing business in the other side of the border, and then they started providing financial services for the local people as well. This is my example for your thoughts and for what you mentioned. First goods or first services, then ideas. And now many Europeans have bank accounts with those commercial banks which are not headquartered in their own countries. Well, Hungarians is a typical example. Of course, well, the level of interconnectedness can be even higher, and I know very well that in international trade we talk about the so-called home bias effect. There is going to be a threshold, what seems to be unsurmountable, but well, it was very clear that the European integration gave a good example. So services, goods first, and then the ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. I want to ask a question to you. You mentioned your also teaching experience dealing with a lot of young generation, also young Africans. How can we reframe the idea of free trade? How can we show that free trade means, as we want to keep it, peace, prosperity, human progress? What are the next steps to engage with the new generation? Because we saw in the US, the sense that the Republicans, they want expanding their electoral constituency in the so-called Rust Belt with a very protectionist narrative. You know? People that were in the Rust Belt, they were voting Democrat because they are against free trade. Until 2015, the Republican Party, still in part, but it was the party that promoted free trade. It was the party that allowed Obama to get the vote of free trade authority. 115 votes for Republican and only 60 Democrat voted for Obama. So 2016 on, the dogma, the paradigm, the faith change also inside the Republican Party. Not with everyone, but there is this type of movement, led mainly by some segment of the market. How can we engage with the young generation? Because this is an opportunity we can see.
What I have seen and what I have observed when teaching in less developed countries is quite interesting when it comes to the students. Well, the decisions are more emotional. Until, for example, many Westerners collect data, they compare data, we talk about ratios. Many decisions are influenced by emotions in Africa and also in my country. And it is necessary to season those emotional-led decisions with facts. And Max highlighted the word, and sorry for mentioning you again, and the word productivity. That is quite visible and that is quite clear. Specialization leads to higher levels of productivity. And we simply have to compare the numbers, the productivity numbers, ratios, hours needed to produce. And once we are capable of using, telling numbers, pointing to why certain countries specialized in producing this or in producing that, my students, for example, and other students would be more willing to understand the importance of free trade. And I always call their attention to the fact that, I'm going to simplify it. When everyone is producing everyone without trading, that means loss for the entire economy. That is, for example, opportunity cost. It is always better to specialize, buy from the best ones, listen to the best ones, and this is going to be much better in the longer run. There were some experiences with import substitution industrializations. You may have heard that from economic history. It is very difficult to know whether it worked or not, because when we open textbooks, we may get very different messages. Some say that, that was fantastic, it could have been even better and things like that. Many others say that that was a bad concept from the very, very beginning. So it is not easy to know what was true or what is true related to that. In order to find out, we have to take into consideration the productivity numbers, the economies of scale, for example, and we will have a better understanding of what worked and what did not work.
Thank you so much. So I want to open the discussion for the public. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and be